In the glittering heart of Los Angeles, where the rich live in fortresses of marble and glass, a desperate man steps through the gates of a mansion, drawn by hunger and the promise of warmth. What begins as an act of survival quickly spirals into a life-changing encounter when the home's owner, Hollywood legend Samuel Jackson, catches him in the act. But instead of punishment, an unexpected offer of mercy sets both their lives on a collision course, leading to a journey of redemption, second chances, and the transformative power of compassion. What happens when one act of kindness ripples through a broken life and reshapes it entirely? The sun had long since dipped below the horizon, leaving the streets of Los Angeles bathed in the pale glow of flickering streetlights. The city buzzed with life, yet for Richie Carr, it was another night of loneliness. His thin jacket did little to shield him from the cold December air, and his worn-out sneakers scuffed against the pavement as he shuffled aimlessly. The ache in his stomach gnawed at him, a constant reminder of how far he'd fallen. Once, Richie had been somebody, a skilled carpenter who crafted beauty from wood, his hands shaping life into furniture and homes. But life had a cruel way of unraveling. First, his wife, Emily, passed away after a grueling battle with cancer. Then came the drinking, the job loss, and eventually the streets. Now, he was invisible, a ghost haunting the corners of the city, ignored by the bustling crowds. Tonight, he was hungrier than he'd been in weeks. His usual spots, the soup kitchen on Maple, the dumpsters behind the bakery, had nothing to offer. As he trudged through the hills, his eyes landed on something extraordinary, a mansion perched like a crown jewel on the hillside. Its towering gates stood slightly ajar, as though beckoning him in. Richie hesitated, his breath visible in the chill night air. He wasn't a thief, at least, not in the way the world would define it. Stealing had never been about greed for him, only survival. The warm glow of the mansion's lights promised shelter, even if only for a moment. Hunger and desperation clouded his judgment as he made the decision. He slipped through the gate, his heart pounding in his chest. The driveway stretched long and winding, bordered by manicured hedges that seemed to mock his ragged appearance. Richie moved quietly, keeping to the shadows. A side door, unlocked and unguarded, was his entry point. Inside, the mansion was nothing like he'd ever seen. Marble floors, high ceilings, and walls adorned with art he couldn't begin to understand. It felt like stepping into another world. But Richie wasn't there to marvel. His focus was on the kitchen, and he found it soon enough. The fridge stood like a gleaming monolith, promising salvation. He opened it and stared, awestruck by the abundance: fruits, meats, cheeses, and more. His hands trembled as he grabbed a loaf of bread and a block of cheddar, stuffing them into the inside pockets of his jacket. He was reaching for a bottle of water when a voice, deep and commanding, shattered the silence. "Who the hell are you?" Richie froze, his heart thundering. Slowly, he turned to face the source of the voice. Standing in the doorway, dressed in a navy bathrobe, was Samuel L. Jackson. Even in casual attire, the man exuded an aura of authority. His unmistakable voice, one Richie recognized from countless movies, was sharper than any blade. I'm sorry," Richie stammered, his hands instinctively raised in surrender. "I didn't mean no harm. I was just hungry." Samuel crossed his arms, his brow furrowed. "So you thought breaking into my house was the solution?" "I didn't know it was your house," Richie admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I swear, I'll leave right now. I ain't looking to cause trouble." But trouble had already found him. Before Samuel could respond, the distant wail of sirens filled the air. Richie's heart sank. He hadn't considered the possibility of an alarm system. Of course, a house like this would be equipped with one. Panic surged through him as he tried to explain himself, but Samuel's piercing gaze pinned him in place. Minutes later, the police arrived. Richie was handcuffed and escorted out of the house, his shoulders slumped in defeat. He caught one last glimpse of Samuel, standing in the doorway with an expression Richie couldn't quite decipher. Was it anger? Pity? Disappointment? As the police car pulled away, Richie leaned his head against the cold window, his breath fogging the glass. This wasn't the first time he'd been arrested, but something about this time felt heavier. Maybe it was the shame of being caught in the act, or maybe it was the way Samuel had looked at him, like he was more than just a criminal. For the first time in years, Richie allowed himself to wonder if there was a way out of the darkness. But as the city lights blurred past, that hope felt as distant as the life he'd lost. The courtroom buzzed with the low murmur of voices, reporters scribbling notes, and the hum of cameras clicking in the background. Richie Carr sat at the defendant's table, his head hung low, a beaten man. His wrists were no longer in handcuffs, but he could still feel the cold weight of them. He avoided the eyes of everyone around him, especially the man seated just a few rows back, Samuel L. Jackson. The headlines had been relentless since the night of the break-in. Homeless man breaks into Samuel L. Jackson's home was plastered across every news outlet. Richie had been reduced to a caricature, a desperate vagrant caught in the act. But sitting in that courtroom, he felt like more than just a story. He felt like a failure. Defendant Carr, please rise. The judge's voice echoed in the cavernous room. Richie stood shakily, his eyes fixed on the ground. He'd been through this routine before. It always ended the same way. A guilty verdict, another stint in jail, and then back to the streets. He braced himself for the inevitable. Mr. Jackson, the judge continued, turning to the actor. As the victim in this case, you have the right to address the court. Would you like to make a statement? The room fell silent. All eyes turned to Samuel as he stood, his tall frame commanding attention. Richie dared a glance at the man who had caught him, expecting anger or righteous indignation. Instead, he saw something he hadn't anticipated: calm determination. Yes, Your Honor, Samuel began, his deep voice resonating with authority. I do have something to say. The room leaned in. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for, the part where Samuel L. Jackson would deliver a cutting speech about justice and the consequences of crime. But what came next shocked everyone, most of all Richie. I'd like to drop all charges against Mr. Carr, Samuel said firmly. The courtroom erupted in gasps and murmurs. Richie's head snapped up, his eyes wide with disbelief. The judge raised an eyebrow, clearly taken aback. Mr. Jackson, the judge said, are you certain? The defendant unlawfully entered your home and could have posed a threat. I'm very certain, Your Honor, Samuel replied, his gaze steady. Look, I know what he did was illegal. But after seeing him and hearing his story, I don't believe jail is the answer. This man doesn't need punishment. He needs help. Richie's throat tightened. He wanted to speak, to say something, but the words caught in his throat. No one had ever spoken up for him like this before. Samuel continued, I've done some digging. Mr. Carr wasn't always on the streets. He used to be a skilled carpenter, had a family, a life. But life threw him curveballs that he couldn't handle. We've all had moments where we could have ended up in his shoes. The difference is, most of us had someone to pull us back. He didn't. The courtroom was silent now, every ear hanging on Samuel's words. He turned slightly, addressing Richie directly for the first time since the night of the break-in. You messed up, man, Samuel said, his tone serious but not unkind. But I see something in you. You're not beyond saving. Richie felt a lump form in his throat, tears pricking his eyes. He didn't trust himself to speak, so he simply nodded. Samuel turned back to the judge. Your Honor, I'd like to propose an alternative. Instead of sending Mr. Carr to jail, let's get him into a rehabilitation program. I'll cover the costs. Give him a shot at turning his life around. The judge leaned back in his chair, clearly weighing the unprecedented request. This is a highly unusual proposition, Mr. Jackson, he said. I understand, Samuel replied. But locking him up won't solve anything. If we're serious about reducing crime, we need to address the root causes. This man broke into my house out of desperation, not malice. I'm willing to take a chance on him. After a long pause, the judge nodded slowly. Very well. I'll allow it, but under strict conditions. Mr. Carr will be placed in a rehabilitation program for a minimum of 6 months, monitored closely by a court-appointed officer. If he violates the terms, he'll face jail time. The gavel came down, and the decision was final. Richie's legs felt weak as he sat back down, his head spinning. He glanced over at Samuel, who gave him a slight nod, as if to say, "Don't waste this." The courtroom emptied out, reporters shouting questions at Samuel as he left. Richie stayed behind, unsure of what to do or how to feel. His public defender patted him on the shoulder, muttering something about how lucky he was. Lucky didn't feel like the right word. Overwhelmed, terrified, maybe even a flicker of hope, but not lucky. As Richie shuffled out of the courtroom, he caught sight of Samuel near the exit. Their eyes met briefly, and Richie managed to croak out the only words he could find. "Thank you." Samuel nodded, his expression softening. "Just make it count," he said before turning and walking away. For the first time in years, Richie felt like he had a chance, not just to survive, but to change. The doors of the rehabilitation center swung open, and Richie Carr stood frozen on the threshold. The building was clean, modern, and welcoming, but to Richie, it felt like the entrance to another world, one he wasn't sure he belonged in. A staff member greeted him with a clipboard and a warm smile, guiding him inside, as if he were just another name on their list. To Richie, this wasn't just a formality. It was the beginning of what felt like an impossible journey. Samuel L. Jackson's unexpected intervention had given Richie this chance, but standing here now, he wasn't sure he could live up to the opportunity. For over a decade, his life had been shaped by survival, not hope. Could he even remember what it felt like to dream of something better? The first days at the center were grueling. The program demanded discipline Richie hadn't known in years. There were group therapy sessions, daily chores, and strict routines. The other residents were a mixed bunch, some young, some older, each carrying their own stories of pain and struggle. Richie mostly kept to himself, unsure if he could trust anyone, even in a place like this. On the second night, during a group session, Richie sat quietly as the others shared their stories. A young woman named Maria, barely in her 20s, spoke about her battle with addiction. Her voice trembled as she described losing custody of her daughter and the shame that drove her deeper into her struggles. When the counselor turned to Richie, he shook his head. "Pass," he muttered, avoiding eye contact. But Maria's story lingered in his mind. That night, he lay awake in his narrow bed, staring at the ceiling. For the first time in years, he thought about Emily, her laughter, her strength, and the promises they'd made to each other. What would she think of him now? Days turned into weeks, and Richie began to settle into the program. He took small steps, cleaning his room, showing up to therapy, and even helping out in the kitchen. The staff noticed his progress, though Richie still carried a heavy weight of doubt. He often thought of Samuel, wondering why the actor had bothered to help someone like him. Samuel didn't forget about Richie, either. True to his word, he visited the center a few weeks into Richie's stay. The visit was unannounced, and Richie was stunned to see the actor walking through the front doors, his presence turning heads. "Mr. Jackson," Richie said, rising awkwardly from a chair in the common room. "Call me Sam," Samuel said with a grin. "How you holding up?" Richie shrugged, his hands stuffed in his pockets. "Better, I guess. Still figuring it out." "That's good," Samuel said, sitting down across from him. "Figuring it out is a hell of a lot better than giving up." They talked for nearly an hour, though Richie did more listening than speaking. Samuel didn't lecture him or offer cliches. Instead, he shared pieces of his own life, his struggles to break into acting, the rejections, and even moments of doubt despite his success. "You know, people look at me now and think I've always had it together," Samuel said. "But that's not true. We all have low points. The difference is, someone believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. That's what I'm doing for you." Richie nodded, his throat tight with emotion. He wanted to say thank you, to explain how much this meant to him, but the words wouldn't come. Samuel seemed to understand. "Keep at it," Samuel said, clapping him on the shoulder. "One day, you'll look back and realize you've come further than you ever thought you could." Over the next few months, Richie threw himself into the program. Therapy sessions became easier, and he began opening up about his past. He talked about Emily for the first time in years, his voice cracking as he described her laugh, her love for gardening, and the way she always believed in him. Maria became an unexpected friend. They bonded over shared struggles, encouraging each other on tough days. "You're tougher than you think, Richie," she told him once after he confided his fear of failing. You've survived worse than this. Richie also found solace in woodworking, a skill he thought he'd lost. The center's small workshop became his sanctuary. He started making simple pieces, birdhouses, shelves, even a rocking chair for the common room. With each piece, he felt a flicker of the man he used to be. The final challenge of the program was securing a job and transitioning back into the world outside. Richie was nervous but determined. With the center's help, he landed a part-time job at a local cafe, doing maintenance and light repairs. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest work, and for the first time in years, he felt like he was contributing to something. On the day he left the center, Samuel showed up again. This time, he brought a gift, a brand new set of woodworking tools. Richie stared at the box, speechless. You've got a talent, Richie, Samuel said. Don't let it go to waste. Tears welled in Richie's eyes as he shook Samuel's hand. I don't know how to thank you, he said. Just keep moving forward, Samuel replied. And when you can help someone else, that's all the thanks I need. As Richie walked out of the center, carrying the tools and a heart full of hope, he realized something profound. This wasn't the end of his journey. It was just the beginning. Richie Carr leaned on the counter of the small cafe, wiping his hands on a rag as he watched the morning rush come and go. The smell of fresh coffee and pastries filled the air, blending with the quiet chatter of customers. The job was a lifeline, simple, steady, and honest. It gave him a purpose he hadn't felt in years. But purpose didn't erase temptation. As Richie walked home that evening, a familiar voice called out from a shadowy corner. Well, if it ain't Richie Carr. Richie stopped in his tracks, his heart sinking. It was Marcus, an old acquaintance from the streets. Marcus had been a survivalist like Richie once, but he had gone deeper into the underworld of drugs and petty crime. His lean figure and jittery demeanor suggested things hadn't improved. Marcus, Richie said cautiously. What are you doing around here? Could ask you the same thing, Marcus said with a smirk. Heard you got yourself a job. Look at you, all cleaned up. Must be nice. Richie didn't respond. He could feel where this conversation was heading. You know, Marcus continued, stepping closer, you don't have to be breaking your back for minimum wage. I got some opportunities, easy money. Richie shook his head, backing away. Not interested. Come on, man, Marcus pressed. You think this new life of yours is going to stick? You really think those people care about you? The second you slip up, they'll toss you right back on the streets. Richie's chest tightened. The doubts Marcus voiced were the same ones that gnawed at him late at night. What if he wasn't strong enough to hold on to this fragile new life? What if everyone saw him as a failure, no matter how hard he tried? I'm done with that life, Richie said firmly. I've got a second chance, and I'm not screwing it up. Marcus scoffed. Suit yourself. But when this second chance falls apart, don't come crying to me. Richie walked away, his shoulders stiff, but his mind worrying. Marcus's words had left a mark, small but sharp. The streets had been cruel, but they were familiar. This new life, with its rules and expectations, felt precarious. Could he really make it? That evening, Richie returned to his tiny apartment, dropping onto the second-hand couch Samuel had helped him furnish. He stared at the set of woodworking tools in the corner, a gift that had become both a symbol of hope and a reminder of the man who had bet on him. He picked up a block of wood and began carving, his hands moving almost instinctively. It was a simple act, but it calmed his racing mind. A few days later, temptation struck again, but this time it was subtler. The cafe owner, a kind older woman named Linda, noticed Richie lingering near the cash register after closing. She trusted him, often leaving him to lock up alone. That night, as he counted the till, the sight of crisp bills stirred something in him. No one would know, a voice whispered in his mind. You've done it before, just a little, enough to get ahead. Richie clenched his fists, disgusted by the thought. He shoved the cash into the safe and locked it, the weight of his own conscience heavier than he expected. This wasn't who he wanted to be anymore. The next morning, Samuel L. Jackson walked into the cafe, his presence drawing curious stares from the other patrons. Richie looked up from the counter, a mix of surprise and relief crossing his face. Sam, Richie said, smiling. What brings you here? Samuel grinned. Thought I'd check in, See how my favorite carpenter is doing." Richie made him a coffee, and the two sat at a corner table. They talked about Richie's progress, the cafe, and the woodworking projects he'd been working on at home. But Samuel had an uncanny ability to see beyond surface answers. "You look like you've got something on your mind," Samuel said, leaning back in his chair. "Spit it out." Richie hesitated before admitting, "I ran into an old friend. He reminded me of how easy it'd be to slip back. And sometimes I wonder if I've really changed or if I'm just pretending." Samuel nodded thoughtfully. "You're not pretending, Richie. You're fighting. And fights aren't easy. The fact that you're even thinking about this stuff means you've already taken a step most people don't." Richie looked down at his coffee. "It's just, what if I mess it all up?" "Then you get back up and try again," Samuel said simply. "Nobody's perfect. I've made my fair share of mistakes. What matters is what you do after. You've got people rooting for you now, Richie. Don't let fear of failure stop you from moving forward." The words settled in Richie's heart, their weight both comforting and challenging. He realized that Samuel wasn't just talking about second chances. He was living proof of what resilience looked like. In the weeks that followed, Richie leaned into his new life with renewed determination. He poured himself into his work at the cafe, even volunteering to fix up the place with his carpentry skills. Linda noticed his efforts and praised him, her words a balm for his self-doubt. Richie also reconnected with Maria, his friend from rehab. They met for coffee occasionally, sharing their struggles and triumphs. Maria had landed a job at a community center and was thriving. Her progress inspired Richie, reminding him that change was possible, even for people like them. The turning point came when Richie built a small bookshelf for the cafe, his first major woodworking project in years. Customers admired it, and Linda insisted on paying him for his work. Holding that money in his hands, earned through honest effort, felt like a victory. One evening, as Richie closed the cafe, he thought about Marcus's words again. But this time, they didn't haunt him. Instead, they reminded him of how far he'd come and how much further he wanted to go. For the first time in years, Richie felt something unfamiliar, yet wonderful: pride. As he walked home, the city lights shining in the distance, he knew the road ahead would still have its challenges. But with Samuel's encouragement, Maria's friendship, and his own growing strength, Richie was determined to keep fighting for the life he was rebuilding, one step at a time. The cafe bustled with life, the hum of conversation blending with the hiss of the espresso machine. Richie Carr moved behind the counter, wiping surfaces, restocking supplies, and occasionally exchanging warm smiles with the regulars. It was a far cry from the life he had known on the streets. Every day here felt like a small victory, a step away from his past and toward the future he was trying to build. Richie's boss, Linda, watched him from across the room, a satisfied smile on her face. The cafe had been her passion for years, and hiring Richie had been a bit of a gamble. But in the months since he'd started, he'd proven himself reliable, resourceful, and kind. She approached him during a lull in the morning rush. "Richie," she said, placing a hand on his shoulder, "you've been doing great here. How do you feel about taking on a bit more responsibility?" Richie blinked, surprised. "Responsibility? What kind of responsibility?" "I was thinking you could help manage the place," Linda said. "I'm getting older, and I could use someone I trust to handle things when I'm not around." "What do you say?" Richie's mind reeled. A year ago, he'd been sleeping in doorways and scrounging for scraps. Now, someone was offering him a managerial role. "Are you sure?" he asked hesitantly. "I mean, I don't have much experience with stuff like that." Linda smiled warmly. "You've got more than you think. You're a hard worker, Richie, and the customers love you. Besides, I trust you. That's what matters." Richie nodded slowly, a flicker of pride stirring in his chest. "I'll do my best," he said. That evening, Richie returned to his small apartment with an unfamiliar sense of accomplishment. The place was modest, just a one-bedroom with thrift store furniture. But to Richie, it was home. The set of woodworking tools Samuel L. Jackson had given him sat neatly in a corner, waiting for the weekend when he'd have time to tinker with his latest project. A coffee table he planned to gift Linda as a thank you. As he settled on his couch, Richie's phone buzzed. It was a message from Maria, his friend from rehab. How's the cafe life treating you, superstar? She'd written. Richie chuckled as he typed back. Good. Linda wants me to take on more responsibility. Didn't see that coming. Maria's reply came quickly. You deserve it, Richie. Don't forget that. Her words lingered with him long after their conversation ended. Richie wasn't used to hearing praise or feeling like he deserved it. But maybe, just maybe, he was starting to believe it. The following week, Samuel L. Jackson made another unannounced visit to the cafe. His arrival, as always, caused a stir. Customers whispered excitedly and scrambled for their phones. But Samuel ignored the attention, his focus entirely on Richie. You're becoming a regular here, Richie joked as Samuel took a seat at the counter. Good coffee, great company, Samuel replied with a grin. Heard you've been promoted. Congrats. Richie scratched the back of his neck, embarrassed. Word travels fast. It does when I keep tabs on you, Samuel said, his tone teasing but warm. Seriously, though, I'm proud of you. You're proving everyone wrong, Richie, including yourself. Richie nodded, his throat tight. Thanks, Sam. I wouldn't have made it this far without you. Samuel waved a hand dismissively. I just opened the door. You're the one who walked through it. Don't forget that. They talked for a while longer, Samuel asking about Richie's woodworking projects in the cafe. Before he left, he handed Richie an envelope. Don't open it until you get home, Samuel said with a wink. When Richie opened the envelope later that evening, he found a letter and a check. The letter was short but heartfelt. Richie, I see the man you're becoming, and I believe in you. This check is to help you take the next step, whatever that might be. A workshop, a new project, or something for yourself. Use it wisely. You've earned it. Some. Richie stared at the check, his hands trembling. It wasn't an astronomical amount, but it was more than enough to set up a proper workshop or invest in something meaningful. For the first time in years, the future felt full of possibilities. Richie spent the next few weeks considering how best to use the money. He decided to rent a small space near the cafe, turning it into a woodworking studio. It wasn't fancy, but it was a place where he could create, dream, and maybe even start a small business one day. The studio quickly became a second home. Richie spent his evenings there, crafting pieces for the cafe, his apartment, and even a few paying customers who admired his work. Linda's coffee table became the centerpiece of the cafe, drawing compliments from patrons and sparking conversations about his talent. One day, a customer asked if Richie could build a custom bookshelf for her home. It was the first time someone had approached him with a commission, and he accepted nervously. When the project was finished, the customer was so thrilled that she referred him to her friends. Slowly but surely, Richie's name began to circulate in the neighborhood as a skilled craftsman. Richie's life wasn't perfect. He still had moments of doubt, and the shadows of his past lingered. But every day he spent working, every piece of furniture he completed, was a reminder of how far he'd come. One evening, as he locked up the cafe, Richie looked around at the quiet streets and smiled. He wasn't the man he used to be, and he wasn't where he wanted to be yet, but he was on his way. And for the first time in a long time, he believed he could make it. The small cafe was buzzing with energy, as usual, but today felt different. Richie Carr stood behind the counter, greeting customers and managing orders with a quiet confidence that hadn't existed a year ago. The once broken man now carried himself with pride, his eyes clear, his shoulders squared. The cafe was more than just a job to Richie. It was a symbol of everything he'd worked to rebuild. But the true heart of his transformation lay just a few blocks away in a modest workshop he'd started calling Carr Creations. What began as a side hobby with Samuel L. Jackson's encouragement had grown into something far bigger. Richie's handcrafted furniture, which started as gifts for friends and pieces for the cafe, had caught the attention of the community. People admired his attention to detail, his ability to take simple materials and turn them into something beautiful. Orders began trickling in, then pouring in, but Richie wasn't content to stop there. He remembered the people he'd met during his darkest days, the faces that haunted him when he closed his eyes at night. People like Maria, like Marcus, and countless others still stuck in the endless cycle of homelessness and addiction. He wanted to give back, the way Samuel had given to him. Richie launched a small initiative from his workshop, hiring individuals in recovery to help with his growing workload. He started with Maria, who had been thriving since completing her own rehabilitation program. Her infectious energy and determination made her a natural fit. Together, they crafted not just furniture, but opportunities. Richie reached out to local shelters and rehabilitation centers, offering jobs to those ready to take the next step in their recovery. The workshop became a safe haven, a place where people could learn skills, earn a living, and rebuild their self-esteem. One day, Marcus showed up outside the workshop, his eyes sunken, his clothes tattered. Richie spotted him and stepped outside. "Marcus," Richie said, surprised. "What are you doing here?" Marcus hesitated, shifting uncomfortably. I heard you were helping people. Thought maybe you'd have something for me." Richie studied his old acquaintance. Marcus looked rough, but beneath the layers of defeat was the same man Richie had once shared scraps of food and stories with. He nodded slowly. "You've got to be serious about it," Richie said. "No shortcuts, no messing around. If you're ready to work and stay clean, I'll give you a shot." Marcus nodded, his voice thick with emotion. "I'll try, Richie. I swear." Word spread about Richie's efforts. Local news outlets ran stories about the homeless man turned craftsman, who was now giving others a second chance. Samuel L. Jackson, ever the supportive mentor, used his platform to amplify Richie's work, encouraging donations and partnerships from businesses and individuals. One day, Samuel stopped by the workshop, his smile wide as he walked through the bustling space filled with laughter and the sound of saws and hammers. "Looks like you've got quite the operation here," Samuel said, clapping Richie on the back. Richie grinned. "It's coming together. Couldn't have done it without you." Samuel waved the comment away. "I told you before, Richie. You did the hard work. I just gave you a nudge." "This," he said, gesturing around the room, "this is all you." They sat in the corner of the workshop, sipping coffee as Richie shared his plans to expand. "I want to open another location eventually," Richie said. "Someplace bigger where we can train more people and maybe even offer classes." Samuel nodded approvingly. "Ambitious. I like it. Let me know how I can help." The ripple effect of Richie's work reached beyond the workshop. The cafe became a hub for the community, hosting fundraisers and events to support the homeless and those in recovery. Richie and Linda partnered to create a pay-it-forward board where customers could buy meals or coffee for those in need. The board was always full, a testament to the generosity Richie's story inspired. Maria became a key part of the operation, running the day-to-day activities in the workshop and mentoring new hires. Her own story of redemption added another layer of hope to the environment. Even Marcus, once a skeptic and a troublemaker, began to thrive. Under Richie's guidance, he rediscovered a love for art and started carving intricate designs into wood. His pieces became some of the most popular items in the workshop's catalog, and for the first time in years, Marcus began to believe in himself again. Richie's journey wasn't without its challenges. There were moments of doubt, setbacks with employees, and the occasional temptation to fall back into old habits. But each time, he leaned on the lessons he'd learned, the people who believed in him, and the strength he'd found within himself. One evening, Richie stood in the workshop, gazing at the wall of framed photos that had become its centerpiece. There was a picture of him and Samuel on the day the workshop opened, surrounded by smiling faces. Next to it was a photo of Maria, holding her first completed project, and another of Marcus proudly displaying one of his carvings. Richie felt a deep sense of gratitude as he looked at the wall. His journey had been messy, filled with pain and struggle, but it had also been transformative. He wasn't just rebuilding his life, he was helping others rebuild theirs. As the sun set over the city, Richie locked up the workshop and walked to the cafe for an evening coffee. The place was lively, filled with familiar faces and new ones. Samuel was there, chatting with Linda at the counter. Richie joined them, the three of them sharing stories and laughs. For the first time in years, Richie felt like he belonged, not just to a job or a community, but to the world. The ripple of Samuel's single act of mercy had grown into waves of change, touching countless lives. And for Richie, the man who once thought he was beyond saving, every day was a reminder of the power of hope, hard work, and second chances.